Welcome. You are here for episode 5 of Counseling Tips for Pastors and Ministry Leaders. And today I'm going to share a few tips for marriage counseling. And maybe that's not full-blown counseling, but how can you, as a pastor, a Bible study leader, a friend, a coworker, a neighbor, a Christian who is caring for families in your community, couples and marriages in your church, how can you best support them and care for them, even if you're not necessarily providing in-depth, intensive, long-term marriage counseling? So I'm glad that you're here just to get a few tips today. The purpose of this podcast is to equip you with handling, recognizing, responding to the counseling-related issues that exist in churches and in ministries, as well as encourage you in your own marriage today, if you are married, and just in general in the ministry work that you are doing. So if this is your first episode of Counseling Tips for Pastors and Ministry Leaders, welcome. My name is Jessica Hayes, and I'm a licensed counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of South Carolina. And I'm the director of a nonprofit Christian counseling center called iHope Christian Care and Counseling. You can learn more about our ministry at ihopeflorence.com. You can find this podcast in audio, video on YouTube, or on our blog. Lots of different options for you. But the goal of this podcast and why our ministry has started it is because we know that counseling and the counseling related issues, relationship issues of life, that's a big deal in our hurting world. And pastors and ministry leaders are truly on the front lines. And so we want to equip you. We want to encourage you. Grab lots of resources. Head over to our website. If you are local in South Carolina, we're available for counseling. We're available for donations to help us keep our fees low for the clients that do come. And I'm excited today to talk about marriage. And I'll just add a quick note here in case you're watching the video. I am recording this not in our counseling offices because they were all full doing counseling. So I'm actually at a local church that helps to support iHope. And so you might see some of the nursery things behind me because I'm sitting in their nursery and it's comfy and it's wonderful. So just a little heads up in case you're watching the video and thinking, where is she? But let's circle around. Let's get back to the meat of our conversation today, and that is marriages. So the first tip that I want to give you as a pastor, as a leader in some capacity, is that you might think it's really obvious to the world that of course you support marriages. Maybe you are married, maybe you just kind of assume, well, I'm a pastor. Of course everybody knows I support marriages. But you would be surprised how often human beings tend to assume that everyone else thinks like they do, which means if someone in your church or in your ministry, someone, a neighbor, a community member, if they are struggling in their marriage, if they're questioning, should I leave? Should I get a divorce? Is this worth it? Is it normal to be fighting all the time? If they are struggling and you're never talking about marriage and God's good plan for marriage and the hope and help that is available for marriages, it's likely that at least some people are just going to assume that it's not that big of a deal to God or to the church. They might assume that they're in it alone. And we know that is not true. And that would be the first place that I would recommend starting, is just by bringing it into your conversations. Maybe you're preaching on it and just mentioning it or doing a whole series on it, whatever that looks like. But make it known that you believe marriage is good, that you recognize marriage can be hard, and that you want to help. You can offer resources. We have those available at iHope. We can definitely give recommendations there. Obviously, this does not necessarily mean you're sending people for marriage counseling, although that absolutely might be a good resource for some couples. But just in a more general way, don't think that you never need to talk about it, because people need to hear from Christians, from pastors and leaders, that marriage is good. It's designed to be good. It is hard in our broken world, and there is help available. So make it a regular part of your conversations. And then from there, it's worth making note that a marriage is two people, right? It's a husband and a wife. And it's very easy in our church culture and context to lean into one side of the story, one side of the marriage. And often that's even just a practical thing of genders. You might go to a single gender Bible study. You might be a lot more likely to sit down for a pastoring conversation or a one-on-one, let's get coffee, let's talk about life. You're probably going to do that with someone of the same gender, which means you're going to hear their perspective of their marriage, their struggles, their strengths, what's working, what's not working, what they want, what they hope for. But you're not necessarily going to hear the other person's perspective unless you seek it out. Now, as I said, I'm a marriage counselor. That is my bread and butter. That is my passion, is family relationships, which starts with our marriages. And I could talk all day about how to do marriage counseling. I'm passionate about it. I love it. It's fun. I think it's really fun to watch people come in on day one and they're struggling and they're hurting, and to see God bring change. It is beautiful. And it's hard, but it's good. And we're not going into the weeds of how to do that today. But you need to be talking about it. You need to set the stage for people that it is hard, but it is worth it, and that God has a plan and a purpose. You can point them to Genesis 1. You can point them to Ephesians 5. You can point them to Colossians and 1 Peter and pretty much every other book of the Bible as well. But there's a lot of gold in the Bible about what marriage looks like. But then when you are sitting down with a person or just having a conversation with a person, we need to be careful to remember that we're only hearing one perspective. And so maybe that means you ask some questions in that conversation to try to help that person think about their spouse's point of view. So you might be a pastor, a male pastor, getting coffee with a guy in your church, and he's struggling a little bit. You can ask questions about, well, when you talked about that with your wife, what were her thoughts? What did she say? Oh, the last time that you had an argument and she did this and this and this, and he's complaining and he's, listing all the things that she did wrong. You might want to redirect him to say, wow, that sounds really hard. You can validate that his perspective is real and his emotions matter, but you might want to redirect him then to think about, well, how did you follow up for some apologies and reconciliation? How did you refocus yourself onto gratitude and what you love about your wife? So even in that one-on-one with the person you're sitting down with, bring it back to include their spouse. Ask them questions to try to get them thinking about what they did, how it impacted the other person, what the other person might be thinking, might be feeling, might be struggling with. And if you're going to move forward, and you might do some marriage counseling type of work with them, you're definitely going to want to hear both people's perspectives. And generally, it's not all that helpful to tell them one person's right and the other person's wrong, because whoever you just said is wrong, well, they're not going to listen anymore. You're not going to be particularly helpful. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to that if there is abuse or infidelity, or there's something very serious going on where God says very clearly, this is right and this is wrong. But for most of the conflict in marriage, most of the struggles, it's not quite that black and white. There's usually not one person right and one person wrong. But just getting them talking together to each other to try to understand, well, honey, what's your perspective? What are you hoping for? What are you struggling with? Get them talking to each other. And of course, there might be times when professional counseling is helpful. Again, at iHope, we offer marriage counseling. We have several counselors who are wonderful with couples. And if you're in South Carolina, we meet virtually, we meet face-to-face. We prefer face-to-face, let's be honest. It's better, but you might not be local to the PD area. But head over to ihopeflorence.com. You can find more resources there. Consider a donation. We are tax-deductible charitable organization in South Carolina. And look into our services. We have a discount for pastors. But I hope that a few of these tips are helpful for you. To, first of all, just talk about marriage. Make it known, make it normal that marriage is hard, but worth it, and God is in it. Point them to Scripture. Make sure they are considering the other person's point of view. Don't leave it out just because they're not in front of you in the conversation. And if you are moving forward in a marriage counseling context, help them hear each other's perspective. Help them talk to each other, not just to you about each other. So I hope a few of these tips are helpful. Make sure to subscribe and follow the Counseling Tips for Pastors and Ministry Leaders podcast or our YouTube channel. Again, you can get it on the blog, hop on our newsletter, and you can get an email every week reminding you, hey, new episode, this is the topic. And I would just invite you, as we're wrapping up, to leave a 5-star written review in Apple Podcast. That boosts us in the algorithm and all that stuff. But that's also a really great way to tell us, in your quick little blurb there, what are the topics you would like for us to cover. We have some plans coming up the next few weeks around anxiety, around burnout, around communication. But the goal of this podcast is to help you, the pastor, the ministry leader, on the front lines of caring for the people in God's kingdom, building up the kingdom through that care that you're offering. And we want this to be helpful. So let us know, and a review is a great way to let us know. We're so glad you're here. Share this with a friend, spread the word, encourage your pastors, your colleagues, and we'll be back next week with more counseling tips for pastors and ministry leaders.